All right, so we will begin this evening's Podium Performance Series webinar, our November edition. So welcome everybody. My name is Manon Wallet. I'm the Executive Director of Coach NB and happy to be here with you this evening. So the most important thing tonight is we want to acknowledge that we've gathered together virtually this evening to learn, network, and share knowledge throughout Turtle Island. We would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you virtually from New Brunswick. New Brunswick is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered traditional territories of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy nations. The territory is unceded as the Peace and Friendship Treaties signed in 1725 and 1726 did not surrender the lands. I'd also like to welcome you to identify in the chat where you are joining us from. As I indicated, the session will be recorded this evening. And of course, you'll have an opportunity to view it at a later time. And secondly, please ensure that your full name along with your NCCP number is presented as in your name. I want to ensure that I provide you with locker credit for this evening's session. We are grateful to be able to host this session this evening with our friends at the Canadian Sport Institute Atlantic, as well as Coaching PEI, Coaching Newfoundland, Coaching Nova Scotia, and Coach NB. So stay tuned as we have a lot of other sessions happening and scheduled throughout the season. One big thing is we will be using the annotate feature this evening in Zoom. So if it's your first time using annotate, perfect. Can't wait to see it. Apparently, Renee has some really great skills. So I'm really looking forward for her to share her craft and how she loves using the annotate feature. No pressure, Renee. So as we get started, it's my pleasure to present to you Renee Matte. Of course, she's a mental performance consultant with CSIA and has an opportunity of working with so many teams throughout provincially, nationally, Canada Games, etc. So of course, I'm just going to read really quickly here. So not only has she been working with athlete coaches, sport organization, administrators for over 8 years. Additionally, Renee has been coaching synchronized swimming, so artistic swimming, my apologies, I always get those confused, for over a decade, which has enabled her approach to consulting from multiple perspectives. Renee consults with athletes, of course, as indicated, of all levels, recreational to nationally ranked for a variety of sports. Her PhD research has focused on performance enhancement, coach and athlete behavior, and hazing in athletics. The combination of academic and practical experiences allows Renee to approach and understand her clients in a very comprehensive way. So without further ado, Renee, floor is all yours.
Perfect. So thank you, Manon. So yes, we will be using the annotate feature just so that our answers can pop up on the screen. That being said, if you don't know how to use it and feel more comfortable in the chat or feel comfortable unmuting your microphones and talking when I ask questions, totally fine. So the idea of blanking the uncontrollable, so inserting our own words into the uncontrollables, came about a few months ago when I was talking to some coaches, and they kept repeating the sentence, one that I'm sure most of you as coaches are pretty familiar with, but the idea of controlling the controllables, right? So we hear that all the time, but then what about the uncontrollables? Are we just meant to ignore them? That's really hard to do, right? So what I aim to do today is give you some strategies and some tools and some things that will help you kind of use some strategies proactively to deal with or to navigate or to fill in the blank as you see fit for the uncontrollables. So we'll do this together. Again, I don't want it to just be me talking at you most of the session. So I'm going to give you some tools, but I'd like you to try to think about examples for you as a coach, but also for you that you could use in your sport environment with your athletes or with just anybody that you encounter in those environments or any of the uncontrollables that you encounter in those environments. So I will get Manon to move on to the next slide that just kind of introduces what it is that we are working on today. So big thing that we are going to do is kind of take in this approach that I like to do. So it's a 3-step approach. The first one is awareness. So I'm going to ask you a lot of questions and I'm going to get you to reflect a little bit. Know that there are no right or wrong answers to the questions that I ask. It's really just whatever feels right or feels honest for you. As we saw with synchronized swimming, right? That word has changed. The name of the sport has changed. So again, as you fill in the blanks, if a word feels right to you in one situation, or you're aware that this would be a really great tool for one context, but might not work in another, totally okay. That's why we build up that awareness. From there, we can move on to creating an action plan or identifying which are the tools or which are the strategies we'd like to try. And then we reflect and we make some adjustments. So this worked really well, I'm going to keep it, or you know what, maybe I need to make some tweaks, things like that, right? My email pops up on the slides, which we will share with you after the session. So if at any point in time you have questions after the fact, feel free to reach out. Just let me know the context with which you're reaching out from so that I can keep everything organized. So with that said, what I'm really hoping you get out of today are some valuable or practical tools, strategies, and skills that you could apply both in and out of your coaching roles, but also I really hope to empower you that you can take these things and actually apply them and use them yourselves without necessarily having to bring in an expert or bring in somebody external, but instead to give you the tools and empower you to feel like I can fill in the blank myself, right? So with that said, here are some examples of some of the words that you can use. I know if you want to move on to the next slide. Perfect. So these are just some example words of things that we can do. So we've got control the controllables, but do we want to navigate the uncontrollables? Do we want to sway them? Do we want to direct them? Do you just want to accept the uncontrollables or manage them or things like that, right? So these are just a variety of synonyms and things that you might use, but again, it's totally up to you to fill the blank as you see fit. I'm going to invite you, we'll try the annotate feature right now. Feel free to put a sticker. So if you move your mouse or click on the screen, the gray bar should pop down. I feel like everybody should be able to see it. And then click on the little pencil or the annotate feature. And if you want to put a sticker, or if the word that you want to use for the uncontrollables doesn't pop up, feel free to put it in the blank space up top by clicking the text box and just typing in the word there. Yeah, so we've got some of that happening. Or again, if there's a word on the bottom that you really like, maybe you want to just put a sticker or an icon on the word that works for you. Yeah, so there we go. We're going to have some fun things with the screen. Yeah, so we can circle them. Yeah, good. And if these options don't work for you, or again, you can't find the annotate feature, feel free to pop the word in the chat that you like. But I like how everybody is again doing what works for them and is again building that awareness of this is a word that speaks to me and this is how I'm going to do. So yeah, we can pivot, we can prepare for, we can accept them, we can understand, we can reframe, managing them. Absolutely, right? So again, there's no right or wrong word. It really is just a matter of understanding what it is that you're trying to do and being purposeful with how you're trying to do it. I know with a lot of the athletes that I work with, they would have some choice words that would not be appropriate to put on the screen, but that's how they feel about the uncontrollables sometimes, is they just, want to say some things about them that aren't so great, right? So again, it's up to us to kind of think about what's the healthiest or what's the best approach that we can use. And again, it sounds like most of us are already on the page of having an understanding of what it is that we want to do with them. Perfect. So we'll erase the screen, Menno, and then we'll move on to the next one. And this is the first kind of activity that I really like to do with the athletes and the groups that I work with. So we might have seen these circles before. Again, we might think of things as either being controllable or uncontrollable, and we don't necessarily see them in more of a spectrum kind of way. So If we move on to the next slide, perfect. What we have here are two ways that I like to kind of understand or dig into or try to just kind of get more depth into the uncontrollables. So rather than having an athlete come to me and tell me, you know, I can control this or I can't control it, right? So having it fall into a black or white or an all or nothing kind of thought, I instead like to introduce them to this circle that, again, works a little bit better. So these are two different circles that I like to use. Both of them work with different groups of athletes. I have worked with the no control, some control, and most control circle with athletes as young as 5. And then I've done the control, influence, and concern circle with groups as old as in their 80s. So again, it works really well. You can adjust it. The way that I like to frame this, and I'm going to ask you this question, and then again, you can use the annotate feature or you can use the chat to type in what factors or your answers to the questions that I ask. So how I preface this is we usually just pick one of the two circles. So feel free to do that. And then the question comes down to really, there are two questions that I like to ask. So what are the factors that affect your performance? Or what are the factors that matter to you or that you care about? So what are the factors that affect your performance? Or what are the factors that you care about or that matter to you? And which circle do you think best represents where it would fit, right? So what are the factors that influence your performance? So again, you can put your coach's hat on and think, what are the factors that influence my performance? And where do I think, in which circle do I think it fits best? Or what are the factors that I care about or that matter to me? And again, which circle would I put it in, right? Or you can put your athlete's hat on and think, how would my athletes answer this question? So I'm going to open it up to you and again, let you type in or write in your answers to what are the factors that influence your performance or that affect your performance, and what are the factors that matter most to you or that you care about. So open it up there. And again, if the chat or the annotate feature doesn't work for you and you would like to unmute and instead just talk about factors, that's totally fine as well. So give you a couple of minutes to write down some of the factors and share your answers to the ones that affect you or that you care about and matter to you. Go for it. Excellent. So we're seeing some answers pop up here. And again, it's really interesting because I do this activity a lot as kind of an icebreaker. So keep putting your answers into the chat or typing them in with the annotate feature if you'd like to. But when I do this, again, the answers that I get typically vary. So as much as we often see the same ones pop up a lot, we also see different things kind of come up. Depending on the sport that we're in, depending on the time of the year that we're in, depending on the level of the athletes, depending on what's kind of salient to them or what's on their mind. So we've got, again, some of the same answers popping up, but we have people placing them in different circles because again, it matters differently to them. I saw earlier in the chat that someone mentioned they were experiencing some power outages. So even if you're an indoor sport, maybe the weather affects you in that getting to practice on time or making sure that it's safe for you to get to practice or that your venue isn't closed or that the power outages don't interrupt your practice. Maybe that's a factor that feels uncontrollable, right? Field conditions, weather, energy, effort, output, attitude, mindset, things like that tend to come up a lot. And so again, what's really interesting is asking this question to your athletes and getting them to see where they place things, right? Because some of us will perceive things a little bit differently. So as much as the weather might not be completely under our control, right? How we react to the weather or how we plan for the weather or how we deal with situations involving the weather might be something that we do, right? And so the one thing that you will notice is on either circle, we don't have the word uncontrollable. Instead, what we have, and what I really like, and again, some of us circled and identified reframe as what we want. What we have here is the idea of, instead of putting uncontrollable in it, we have something like concern, because what we want to do is, again, reframe it as, rather than feeling like we have no control over something, we instead can look at it as, it's still important to me and it still concerns me. And then we'll do our next activity and we can kind of see how, or we can dig a little bit deeper and understand that uncontrollable a little bit more. On the other circle, as much as we have no control, sometimes I will put things like less control, right? So we have most control, some control, or less control over at the top. But again, totally up to you to frame these circles however you want to, as long as you give at least 3 options of what the circles are, rather than seeing it as a binary one or the other kind of thing, because it makes people a little bit more psychologically flexible to see the circles and to think about what it is to them. This is a really great question, or when I use this tool, what I find is when you ask people on the spot, or you put them on the spot and ask them, you will get a lot of generic answers, or you'll get the first things that pop into their mind. This is a really great one to end a practice on and then start the next practice. So get them to go home and think about it a little bit, have conversations. So on the car ride home, right? Sometimes that can be a little bit awkward depending on how things go, but send them home with that question of like, what are the factors that you care about or that affect your performance? And then have them start to kind of talk about those kinds of things. And what you'll get is, again, a little bit more depth and reflection to the answers that we have. So again, I'm seeing a whole lot of really, really great answers here. And it's nice that I'm seeing a variety of answers pop up here. So perfect. What I want you to do is kind of take a picture of this, or keep in mind the answers that you put down, because the next step, and again, you can start here if you want to, but you also don't have to. And we'll erase the screen and we'll move on to the next one. So we start here by kind of understanding or defining what some of the uncontrollables are that matter to us, because we can have some that, again, don't affect our performance, or don't really impact us, or don't matter to us. But then we can also sometimes see the uncontrollables one way, and then when we have a conversation or when we ask further questions, we actually understand them a little bit better and what they mean to our athletes. So this is a really great exercise to do one-on-one with your athletes after they've maybe identified some of the uncontrollable factors that matter to them or that impact their performance. Again, with the rule of 2 and with Safe Sport, this is actually a really great way to bring the parents on board as well. And so if you have a quick 5 to 10 minute meeting with the athlete and one of their parents or guardians, then they can actually get on the same page of, oh, this matters a lot to my kid, and I can actually have this conversation with them. So the way that we do this to investigate the uncontrollables is, first, we kind of identify, okay, what are those things in that outer circle of either of the 2 circles that I asked you on the previous slide, right? So what feels out of our control, or that we have no or less control over, or what is something that concerns us, right? So when we ask our athletes to come up with a list of the factors that influence their performance or that they care about, right? So what exactly is your concern, right? So again, if we have here, I love that there's already an example on there. That's fantastic. So being very early or having a late game, right? So if you have to play really early, or you have to show up really early for training or things like that. Or I know for me personally, I have a lot of athletes that hate being late for games, or hate having to wait around a lot. So they've timed their prep for it to last a certain amount of time. So again, what's the concern? Is the concern that it makes me feel really anxious when I am early, or when I feel like I have nothing to do? Or do I feel really anxious when I don't feel like I have enough time to prepare? So what is the concern? If we dig into it a little bit more, what do we see? I'll give you an example that I see a lot, which doesn't really matter what the sport is, but officials are one of the biggest uncontrollables, right? So our referees, our umpires, our lines people, our judges, any person who has some kind of administrative or kind of officiating role in sport can make or break our experience in a game or in a race or in a performance environment, right? So when I ask, okay, so we put the referees down, what about the referees concerns us? And what's really interesting with that is, again, when I ask that question, we get a lot of the same answers, but when we follow up with, why does this concern matter to you? So why is the referee, like, why do the referees affect you? Or why is this important to you that we address the referees, right? And in the last couple of weeks, I've asked this question because it's come up a lot with different athletes, and I've gotten different answers. So from coaches, a lot of the times it'll be things like safety issues. So the inconsistency of calls might make it that some of my athletes feel like they're in danger, or maybe some teams are getting a little bit more aggressive and they're getting away with it. Some of my athletes tie it into their core values. So one athlete in particular has a core value of fairness. And so when the athletes when the referees make a call that they disagree with or that they feel is unfair, it hurts them a little bit more because it's something that hits their identity, where they're like, I don't like this sport anymore because it doesn't feel fair to me. So again, the concern here is this idea of fairness, right? Sometimes with the answer to officials or any referees, right? Why does it matter to you? Well, because there are rules for a reason and we need to stick to them. And how am I supposed to explain a system, or how am I supposed to develop athletes if there's inconsistency with the way that things are being judged or things are being officiated, right? So again, we get into this idea of why does this matter to you? And we get a little bit more depth. We investigate a little bit more. We understand things at a deeper level. So then what we do is we start our action plan. So we're building our awareness with the what and the why questions, and then we can get into our action plan with, okay, so how do we exert control over this concern, right? How do we influence it? So we kind of reframe or flip things around to understand it a little bit more. So if it's a safety issue, well, what can I do as a coach? Do I need to talk to our organizing or to our head organization? Do I need to talk to our PSO or our local governing body just to make sure that we're on the same page? We know what the rules are. We know what the calls are. If it's a fairness call, maybe it's this idea of, we're biased to think about all the calls that are unfair. And so I need to point out all the times that the refs make a call that actually does feel fair, right? Exactly. So we're already seeing people think about, okay, this is how we can do things, or this is how we can modify things. And then we feel more empowered, or we feel more proactive about what it is that we can do. And those uncontrollables feel a lot more controllable, right? We start to exert a little bit more control over them rather than just ignoring them or assuming or complaining about them after they have it, right? So already we have this idea, we have people thinking about this. So again, a really great way, or a really great exercise that you can do with your athletes that get them to think about things a little bit more, rather than just seeing uncontrollables as this really big cloud that hangs over them, right? And it's also a really great way for you as a coach to think about, okay, well, what are the things that affect my performance and in turn affect the way that I interact with my athletes and my team, right? So why does this matter to me so much? So wait, usually I'm okay with the officials not, necessarily making all the calls that I would also make. But we're in the finals for the championship game. It matters a lot because this could affect the results. So this is why I'm getting more emotional, or this is why I'm anticipating it affecting me a little bit more than it would in a regular game. So how am I going to deal with it when there's more pressure, or when I feel like the stakes are a little bit higher? What do I want to do then? How might this affect me a little bit differently? Things like that. So we can plan for, we can reframe, we can think about it when we just ask 3 simple questions, right? So we investigate a little bit further. I'll give you a couple of seconds if you want to take note of what's on there so far, or if you want to add anything else, and then we will move on to our next activity. So any questions so far? Est-ce qu'il y a des questions jusqu'à date? Perfect. So we'll erase this slide and we will move on to more of the house. So at this point in time, I'm going to give you a few more examples or some more tools and strategies that we can use. And I filled in the blank with a word that I really like for it. But again, if there's another word that you would like to use instead, that's totally fine. So the first set of strategies that we are going to deal with all deal with kind of looking at the uncontrollables in a different way or with a different perspective. So the definition of reframing from a psychological perspective is the idea of identifying and then changing the way that we look at situations, experience, events, ideas, or emotions, right? So it's just about our perspective or the way that we view them, and then changing that up just a little bit. So what I'm going to invite you to do now is, again, think about some of the uncontrollables that we just identified in the first 2 activities. And the first thing that I want you to do is, all right, let's reframe how we would deal with them or how we would approach these if we were thinking about the process. So rather than an outcome, which is a typical uncontrollable that people tend to, want to control. So we want to control the result. We want to, again, get to a certain target or a certain goal. But thinking about the outcome doesn't actually get us to the outcome. So instead, what we do is let's reframe the way that we're looking at this. Let's make the idea of how we achieve the outcome be based on the process and what we can do. And what I find is, again, when we're thinking of an outcome, which tends to be a little bit further away, what we can do is just trace our steps back and break down the process of how we get to that outcome, or what enhances the likelihood that we would get to the outcome with different keywords or different fundamentals that we want to focus on, right? So again, think of an outcome or goal that you might have as a coach, and then think of how we would break it down. So what are the targets that we want to hit before that, or what are the keywords or the fundamentals that we need to hit that break down the process of how we get there. So I'll invite you, because the slide has a lot of words on it already, so I'll invite you to write in the chat maybe the goal and then break down into a few keywords or fundamental things that you want to keep in mind, how you would get to the goal that you want to get to. So what's the process of getting to a goal that you want to get to? So feel free to write it in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourselves and share your idea out loud with the group if you would like to. While you are typing or thinking of your ideas, I'll give you an example. Right, so one of the examples that I have with a lot of my athletes is they would like to, so we'll use volleyball as an example. If they want to try to get to 25, right, so they want to try to win the set, then they need to think about things like, oh, well, then I need to get my serve over the net. So how do we get your serve over the net? Well, I think about my approach. I think about my pre-performance routine. And then I think about having a really great toss and connecting with the ball. So at that point, we've got approach, we've got routine, we've got toss and connect. So we've broken it down to 4 key action words, which, yes, we have the target of getting to 25, but the process of it is, these are the actions I'm going to do to get there. And those keywords are linked to fundamentals of how we get a serve over, or how we get a technique over, right? Things like that. If part of your process or part of the outcome is for the weekend to be to go really smoothly, right? Well, so the process for that is actually under my control would be to plan ahead, to build in times where I can, to make sure I have supports available to me, right? So we, again, break it down into the process of how we would plan adequately and think of it that way. I'm seeing some really good examples pop up in the chat. I don't know, Menno, if you want to share some of the ones, if you're okay with it, participants who have written in the chat, I hope so. But Menno, do you want to maybe share some of the ones that have come up there?
Yeah, absolutely. They're really good. So one of them, the most recent was, my goal would be to be prepared in advance with options. So to be able to use the can-do language.
Mm-hmm.
Another one would be, I have used reframed by focusing on strength by choosing an animal. The group really enjoyed that and continued using it for the rest of the season. So that's a U14 level. Aim to rephrase into a positive context. So from this hurts to I'm working my hardest.
Yeah. Right. So again, at that point in time, we've taken some of the things that were in the first two circles of the first activity, things that were under our control, that we had the most control over, or things that we could influence. And again, we've applied keywords that we can repeat to ourselves, or we can repeat to our athletes throughout our practices, or at any time, really, right? And at that point in time, we've allowed ourselves to reframe, we've allowed ourselves to situate ourselves or put ourselves in a place where it feels more positive, it feels more productive. And again, we get a lot more out of it. It feels more intentional because we phrased it in a way that is productive or works, rather than thinking about something that, again, feels out of reach or feels really far away or feels like we have no control over it. So we've exerted some control or some influence over it. The other thing that we can do, because one of the big things that comes up as a very big controllable are the decisions that we make, right? Or the choices that we make. So again, sometimes we get caught and we make a decision that we feel is wrong, or that, if we could go back, we would change it. But that's just the idea of sometimes we need to take it back to our ABCs. So one of the ways that I like to reframe the decision-making process, either for myself or for the athletes that I work with, is to, again, bring it back to the ABCs. So we bring about awareness of, okay, I'm thinking about something that feels uncontrollable, or that I would label as uncontrollable. So I have this awareness. I'm going to take a deep breath, and I'm going to make a choice about how I want to approach the situation, or how I'm going to deal with it, or how I'm going to think about it, or how I'm going to phrase this so that it feels like something that I can do. But we have the awareness, so that's our what. We have our breath, which is kind of our pause. So we maybe think about or connect with our why a little bit more. And then we make a choice that, again, connects to our how. So how am I going to approach it? How am I going to deal with it? What choice am I going to make in service of what works for me, or what feels productive for me? But we just break it down into that process of, okay, are we thinking about our ABCs right now? And once you get athletes thinking about that, again, it simplifies the process. It also makes it so that they're thinking about something productive, rather than getting caught up in the emotions or the heaviness that sometimes comes with feeling like we're out of control, or things are uncertain, or things are up in the air a little bit more. So the second way that you can reframe things is to, again, just bring awareness to the situation, take a deep breath, and then just make one choice at a time. Right? So we can, as coaches, can simplify it by asking a choice question. So how would you like to deal with it? Or how is this making you feel? Things like that. But how-based questions are always really great for choice, because it gets athletes thinking and talking a little bit more. And then this last one, the way that we can reframe it is using what we call a strengths-based approach. So we already had an example of an animal, which it's awesome to hear that some people are doing it. This is an activity that, again, can be really fun and athletes can get really into it. Some athletes, though, have a really hard time thinking about the animal that they want to embody, or they don't feel like they want to be an animal, and sometimes they want to be an object instead. Whatever it is, totally fine, as long as you, again, get them to identify characteristics and strengths that they possess, right? So this is why it's okay for you to be a really great spotlight, because you are so focused and so direct. So you don't want to be a giraffe, you want to be a spotlight, that's totally okay. So what we'll do for this one is, again, think about different situations where the uncontrollables come up, or where they take over, or where they, again, examples of times where you encounter uncontrollables, and what would be the characteristics that would help you navigate, reframe, or deal with those uncontrollables. In that situation, what animal makes you think of those characteristics, right? So I'll invite you again to unmute yourselves and share out loud the example of the animal you want to be in the situation that comes up, or to write it in the chat if you haven't done so already, or again, to just write it on a separate piece of paper or think about it in your head if you would like to. While you are doing that, I will give you the example that I've written here. So one of the big ones, as soon as I mention animals, that comes up is tiger. Everybody wants to be a tiger, which is really fun because then we get them to list the characteristics or the strengths that a tiger has. So one that's come up a lot, especially since COVID, is just people's ability to deal with uncertainty. So athletes don't like the uncertainty. They like knowing what's going to happen. So uncertainty feels like a really big uncontrollable, that it's a curveball that a lot of them feel like if they swung at it, it would strike them out, and they don't like that, right? So again, we think about, okay, when we deal with uncertainty, right, what are some of the traits that we want to have? Well, when things feel uncertain, I'd rather feel really focused. When things feel uncertain, I feel really anxious and uncomfortable, and I don't like that. So instead, I want to feel like I have power, right? Or that I can dominate, or that I can overcome this obstacle, right? So we take a couple seconds and we sit there and we think, all right, we're going to be a tiger right now. We're dealing with something. We don't know what the outcome's going to be, but we're going to be focused on doing the best job that we can. What are some of the cue words that make you think about what you need to do, right? And then we break it down there. Let's take a deep breath and kind of really feel grounded and feel really powerful about what it is that we're going to do. And then let's think about words that motivate us or that make us feel like we can dominate whatever you throw at us, right? And we get them kind of excited about getting to deal with this rather than it being just another thing that is hard for them to deal with. So we've reframed, instead of thinking about this as a really big problem, we've reframed it as, I have the tools to deal with it and I can do it because I have these characteristics. I am the strong person. I am the strong tiger. I can do it, right? Menno, I'll invite you again to unmute if you're okay with it and share some of the examples that came up in the chat.
Absolutely. There's some great examples actually. So Chantal wrote it you're gonna excuse me if I say it wrong. A chameleon?
A chameleon.
Chameleon. Okay, thank you. Able to adapt to the environment without losing your own stride. Really cool. Nick mentioned an otter, so being creative, smart, prepared, one of the only animals known to use tools to hunt and regularly carry rock and case. Sorry, there's a thing on top of my thing. I'm not sure why. Rock in case. I like preparing so that when the plan fails, you can pivot.
Yeah, right. And so again, it just becomes this idea of then, in like, once you've explored this with your athletes, they can just tell you like, right now I need to be an otter, and you'd be like, okay, you go for it, right? And then they can go off and they can be prepared, they can have their tools, they can be ready to go. Right, you know what, we need to be a little bit more like chameleons right now. Everybody show me your best chameleon pose. And then it becomes, again, a way to rally the group around what's happening rather than having it be, again, this really big thing that feels, you know, uncontrollable and overwhelming. The other thing too is it's a really great way for athletes to kind of express their identity and to understand themselves a little bit more and to discover the strengths that they maybe didn't think that they had, right? Is we get them to think about it from something separate from them, and then we get them to relate it back to them. So right now, you are being such a great eagle because you are just soaring above all of the drama that is happening. And I love that about you, right? So it's another way for you to connect with your athletes by pulling out some of the traits that maybe don't get recognized as much, or again, to identify them as individuals rather than just as a team or rather than just as an athlete. So it allows them to do that. You also get to learn about really cool animals and things that maybe you didn't even know exist. And some of, like, my 4-year-old nephew is really into dinosaurs and could tell you about all the different types of dinosaurs, and I know nothing about them. So when he tells me that he is, you know, being a diplodocus, or I don't even know how to say it, I'm like, that's so great. What are they like, right? And then again, it gives you that chance to connect. It makes the sport environment feel a little bit more fun, and it again, takes away some of that stress or some of that anxiety or some of those negative feelings around some of the uncontrollables. It's also a really great way, if there is a weather delay, to spend time not super focused on what's going on, or if you have, way too much time on your hands, or you need to energize your athletes, getting them to think of themselves as animals is a really fun way to pass the time. So other activities that you can do to help you reframe the uncontrollables. You don't have to do them all, but take and choose the ones that, again, work for the groups that you are working with or that speak to you. Perfect. So we'll move on to a set of other activities. So again, I'm going to throw, I think, about like 12 different tools at you. I don't expect you to use them all, but take the ones and keep the ones or tweak the ones that you feel work for you. So the next thing that we want to do with the uncontrollables, oh, too far, go back one.
Sorry.
Perfect. No, it's all good. So the next thing that we want to do, again, a lot of our uncontrollables affect the way that we think or that we feel. So they affect our thoughts and our emotions, which in turn affect our behaviors and our performance. So some of the things that we want to do is, rather than seeing the uncontrollables as just this thing hanging over us, sometimes we can neutralize them. So we know that they're going to be there. So rather than ignoring them, or rather than trying to move past them, or rather than trying to focus all our attention only on the controllables, what we can do is, again, just neutralize the way that we're judging or the way that we're viewing things, and have a more neutral way of accepting or looking at the situation. So this one's a little bit harder to do with younger athletes, but it is a really great way to kind of introduce them to the idea of what we call just acceptance, right? So sometimes there are going to be things that don't go the way that we want to, and we have to be okay with it, or we have to learn to be able to move on from it. So one of the big things that I like to do is identify what some of the more evaluative, or like the more judgmental language that some of the athletes that I work with use. So we try to remove any evaluative qualifiers. So things being good or bad, or right or wrong, or the best or the worst, right? So, oh, that was such a good call from the referee, or that was a bad call from the ref, right? That doesn't tell me a lot about what the call was, right? Or, oh, this person is like, the audience members are, yelling at the right time, or what, they keep yelling at me at all the wrong times. Instead of thinking of it that way, again, we try to remove, or we try to reframe, or we try to understand the words a little bit more, right? The last thing that often comes up too is how we qualify our equipment. So again, that's such a bad rock for curling, or that's such a bad ball. I don't like this ball, right? Like that, again, makes it so that we're already putting emphasis on something that feels uncontrollable. This is the equipment we're going to be using, right? So let's instead use more helpful qualifiers. So what is it about this ball that makes it bad? Oh, it's flat. Oh, okay. So should we just put more air in it? And then we've taken it and we've exerted influence over changing what is bad about this rock, or that was the wrong call, or that was the right call, things like that. Well, why do you think that was the wrong call, right? So again, you get them to explain, and then you also get to introduce some of the rules of, what, it's a call that I would disagree with too, but that's how they saw it, and they've been calling it consistently like that all game, so I think that's okay, right? So again, it just allows you to remove some of the more emotional language, or some of the language that can incite more of those strong emotions, and you can get into it a little bit more by just kind of asking, what is it about this call, or this ball, or this situation, right? Like, oh, I love playing in the rain, it's the best. Okay, what do you like about playing in the rain? Oh, I like that it's cool, and because I get really hot when I have to run around. Oh, that's great to know, right? Or, oh, this is the worst, I hate it when the field is all slushy, or the conditions aren't great. And then we kind of, again, can flip it to, well, what about it is the worst? And they're like, I have to work really hard. And then again, you can bring in an animal and be like, you know what other animals work really hard? Oxes work really hard. So let's go and be an ox right now. And we'll just, work our way through it. But it gives you, again, a way to connect or a way to understand the uncontrollable a little bit more. And then you can reframe or you can influence what it is about the good, the bad, the right, the wrong, the best or the worst, or any of that kind of evaluative language a little bit more. This one, again, can be really hard if you have athletes that aren't necessarily aware of the language that's coming out of their mouths, or if you as a coach don't realize that you're doing this. So the other way that you can kind of reframe this to keep it to the facts is to ask yourself or to ask your athletes, okay, on a scale from 0 to 100, if I were to ask 100 people, if we were on Family Feud right now, right, how many of them do you think would say that the statement you just made is true or is accurate or that it's possible or that, right? Like, what's the qualifier we want to put here? And as soon as you put a number on it, again, you kind of see that light bulb go off in a lot of athletes where they're like, oh, you know what? If you were to ask the whole other team, they would say that that was the right call. So maybe it just depends on who you're asking, right? So maybe this is a scale from 0 to 100, we're at like 50. Oh, do I need to get upset about something that's only a 50? Maybe not, right? But then if we have something that, you know what, on a scale from 0 to 100, my anxiety, like, so how possible I think this is, or how likely I think this outcome is, it's really high up there. That's when we can be like, okay, let's use another strategy to get ourselves to calm down a little, or to get ourselves to a place where we're ready to kind of deal with or navigate the uncontrollable that's in front of us. But by putting a number, by quantifying it, again, we break the thought pattern. We get them to kind of settle down a little bit, to think more analytically about the situation. And a lot of the times that can be enough to get people to think about situations more logically rather than emotionally. And when we take the emotion out of it, again, things feel a lot more under our influence or under our control. So those are two ways that we can kind of stick to the facts. Hopefully they make sense, but if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute or to ask them in the chat. Happy to get to them. The other way that we can neutralize things is to have something that we can repeat to ourselves. So a little bit of a calming mantra, and it doesn't have to be calming to the point that it makes you want to fall asleep, but just calming that it kind of brings you to more of a neutral energy level. So some of the examples that I have with athletes or teams that I work with would be things like, it just is, right? So it's not good, it's not bad, just is, right? And so they just kind of break it down to, it is what it is, or things like that. And that kind of gives them a sense of peace of like, you know what, do I want to save my energy for a bigger fight that I have later? Or is this a battle that I want to kind of stick with? Nope, it is what it is. I'm okay with it. Hakuna Matata is another one. It's a little bit outdated now. The new one that has come up a little bit more is Let It Go. So I have a lot of athletes that like to pretend they are Elsa and will sing Let It Go at the top of their lungs, which is always really fun. Some are great singers and others can practice a little bit more, but it is what it is, right? So we have, again, something that they connects with, a TV show that they watch. So what's something that one of your favorite TV characters says? Like, what do they do when they deal with a problem? And then again, it gets a little bit more of their personality out, has them having a little bit more fun, and puts them in a more positive or neutral headspace. One of the big ones that comes up, especially during a game or during a performance where you don't have a lot of time to stop, pause, rate things on a scale from 0 to 100, they just have a really quick thing of like, next one, right? So I'll get the next one, or I'll clear my mind. So with goaltenders especially, we like to kind of clear the space in front of them, and then everything that's bad goes behind them. Everything else is an opportunity in front of them. So they look at it that way of next one, or again, things like clear or reset and forget. Really what it is here, and again, athletes can have a lot of fun thinking about what it is that they want to say. It just has to be something that they're okay with saying in the moment where they experience the uncontrollable. So this is a really good one to come up with 2 or 3 and then have them test it out in an actual game situation or in during an actual performance to see which one works in that moment. So when I have it, Is it that I need to think of a giant stop sign so that instead of, saying these things in my head, tell myself to stop, and that's my reset, or that's my calming thing, and that gets me to go to a better place? Or is it that I want to say Hakuna Matata, or let it go, or next one, or clear, reset, forget it? My go-to, and this is because I really like to snap my fingers, is snap out of it. And that's really fun. But again, if I'm working with swimmers and things, while you're doing your freestyle, you can't really snap your fingers, A, because of the water, but B, because you have to be thinking about what your hands are doing. So whatever it is that is your mantra, make sure you can use it in your performance situation, or when you would encounter thoughts and things that are a little bit out of your control that you want to neutralize. Make sense so far to anybody? Perfect. If you have examples of phrases you've used or that you've heard and that you really like, feel free to pop those in the chat as well. The last one, and this one is, again, more for coaches rather than athletes, but this is a really good one, because I find athletes or coaches tend to be hard on themselves with how they deal with the uncontrollables or how they manage situations. So one of the things that you can do is kind of learn to practice acceptance that you too are human. Yes, you might be a really great animal with all these awesome characteristics, but at the end of the day, you're also a human. And so one of the ways that we practice acceptance is with the idea of, okay, I give myself permission to make mistakes sometimes, or to not plan for everything, or for things to go wrong, or to handle situations, emotionally, right? Like, I give myself permission to, but then what you have to do is invite something productive, something that helps you and helps you kind of move forward in after, right? So I give myself permission to make mistakes, but I give myself the chance to learn, or I invite those lessons to be learned so I make new mistakes next time, right? So again, this is just something that kind of allows us to get to a point where we reflect, we calm down, but we also acknowledge that you don't have to be perfect all the time. Again, better for coaches. It's hard for a lot of athletes to wrap their heads around this idea. A lot of them get overwhelmed by this idea of giving yourself permission and then inviting something else in. This is a really great one to kind of do at the end of a long day, or at the end of a long tournament, or at the end of something. That's okay, Manuel. We're moving on to this one anyway, so we'll stick there. I give you permission to move on to the next slide, and I'm inviting you to write your answers in the chat if you want to. But yes, if there are any questions about those so far, feel free to pop them in the chat, or to let us know at the end as well. So we're moving on to the last set of exercises that we have, or tools that we have. And this is the idea of wanting to pause the uncontrollables. So again, time is one of those uncontrollables that we all wish we might have more of, or sometimes, like if you're the men's national soccer team, maybe you wish you had a little bit less of, but sometimes we want to pause the uncontrollables. So what pausing kind of allows us to do is it just kind of slows things down and gives us a chance to ground ourselves a little bit more. So with the pause, what it does is it just, again, expands how much capacity you have for things. Without the pause, what we see is a reaction that just has two P's. So we see people panic, right? So they deal with the uncontrollable, they're confronted with the uncontrollable, and then they just try to push past it, they try to forget it, they just proceed, right? Without a lot of thought or intention. But when we pause, what we have is still that initial panic. So we're aware that something is happening, we're dealing with an uncontrollable, but I take a second to pause. I can then process things from a more logical or more self-aware place. I can then plan accordingly. And then when I proceed, chances are that the result is going to be a lot more productive and positive than just my initial proceeding after panic, right? So panic-induced state, while in some sports absolutely works because you don't have time for all 5 Ps, when dealing with most uncontrollables, especially as coaches, we typically have time, or we typically feel grateful when we take the time to pause, process, plan, and then proceed. So if we can break things down into at least 3 Ps. So it doesn't even have to be that you do all 5 of them, but if you at least insert 1 P extra from the panic to proceed, what you will find is that things tend to be better. So if you're one of those people that panics, but then can come up with a plan and then proceed, again, you'll find yourself much better off than if you just panic and proceed. So some of the ways that you can pause or that you can help kind of extend that time would be to ground yourself in something that is controllable. So one of the big things that we tend to see a lot of is our breathing. And so with that, it would be the idea of just kind of taking a few deep breaths. So some of the tempos that athletes I've worked with have really liked would be an even inhale, exhale. So a 5 count inhale and a 5 count exhale. Some really like the idea of more of the 4-7-8 breathing. So if you have a lot of athletes that perform restorative practices, so do yoga or do meditations and things, this is a common breathing pattern that they do, which is you inhale for 4, you hold that inhale for 7, and then you exhale for 8. Basically, anytime that your exhale is longer than your inhale, you tend to calm down a little bit more. It just kind of gets your autonomic nervous system to relax a little bit. The other one that's really popular, some of you might know it as box breathing, but it just becomes this idea of it's a 4 count inhale, a 4 count hold, a 4 count exhale, and then a 4 count hold of that exhale. So everything is nice and even, and you can just follow the different sides of the box to breathe. Typically, if you do about a minute, so 60 seconds of it, so, 5 to 10 breaths like this at this tempo, what you'll find is that you've paused long enough to be a little bit more clear-headed. Some of the athletes that I work with, though, get really anxious when they have to focus on their breathing. So what we do is we breathe to the tempo of their favorite song. So they put their ear pods in and then they just listen to the song, which has a nice consistent beat, and they just breathe to the tempo of their choosing while listening to that music, and it distracts them enough to not be so anxious or not just be focused on their breathing. So it's a really great way for them, again, to ground themselves in something that's happening while not getting so overwhelmed by stimuli that makes them feel really anxious. The other thing that you can do if breathing isn't your thing is you can focus on your senses. So because typical sporting events don't always smell or taste so great, tend to focus mostly on what we can see, what we can hear, what we can touch, which is why when I do our senses, I will do what we call the 3x3, which is you literally look around the room and you identify 3 objects. You say, that is, so right now, if I'm looking in my office, I can say, this is a water bottle, and then you take a deep breath and you repeat that 3 times. So this is a water bottle, take a deep breath. This is a water bottle, take a deep breath. This is a water bottle, take a deep breath, right? So again, you can have the athletes focus on something. For instance, if you want to tie it back to the neutralizing, so if they were complaining about the equipment, have them look at it, that is a ball. It's not a bad ball, it's not a flat ball, it doesn't have any qualifiers. That is a ball, take a deep breath, that's a ball, take a deep breath, that's a ball, take a deep breath. And again, it tends to be enough to get them to pause and to then be able to proceed or plan a little bit better. If you happen to be in an environment that doesn't have awful smells and doesn't, that tasting things is okay, you can also do a more complete sensory countdown where you name 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And again, getting them to ground themselves, or getting athletes to ground themselves in their senses, helps calm things down, helps them pause a little bit more, helps bring all of the uncontrollables that are outside of their bodies kind of out of focus for a second and focus on something completely controllable, which is their own body and their own self, right? So helps ground them in that as well. The other thing that I like to do, or that athletes really, really like, is because uncontrollables, again, tend to be overwhelming, tend to feel outside of ourselves, we can instead connect with the physical space that we're in. So you can connect by putting a hand on the wall, and again, just kind of being in that space and just being present in the space that you're in, a lot of the athletes that I work with really like to just kind of ground their feet. And so they put their feet on the floor and they really connect. What do my feet feel like against the floor, right? They wiggle their toes. So again, it just kind of brings their attention out of their head and into more of their center or more of their lower body, so that, again, they're just not overthinking things, or they're not just ruminating over all the uncontrollables or all the things that feel unfair, or all the things that, you know, they can't do anything about. And again, it gives them a sense to just kind of be in the space, enjoy being in the space, and pause for a second rather than running away from themselves, right? So connecting with the physical space can be done even if you're sitting in a chair, or you're sitting on a bench, or you're laying down on a mat, really whatever it is that allows them to just kind of be in the space that they're in. One of the ways that I like to remind people of this is to just be where your feet are, right? So oftentimes, so I coach artistic swimming, so we're often at a pool, and often our feet are actually up in the air. So what we do is, okay, but we're going to be where our feet are. So if our feet are up in the air, then that's where we're going to be. We're going to stretch ourselves nice and tall. We're going to take up some space because we deserve it. And we're just going to be in the space. We're not going to be doing a technique or pushing past it or swimming or trying to do, no, we're just going to spend 5 seconds to be in the place that we're in, take a survey where we are, and then we'll move on from there after we've just been in the space that we are in, right? So be where your feet are helps people get out of their heads and into the space a little bit more. The other thing that you can do is what we call parking the uncontrollables. So sometimes uncontrollables, again, are things that have nothing to do with sports. So you have a lot of schoolwork, or you've had a really hard day at work, you have a lot of deadlines that you have to do, and you know after practice you're going to have to go home and get back on your computer and listen to this crazy person talk for a couple of hours, and it's a lot, right? So what we can do is, if we want to leave that stuff out of the gym, out of the pool, out of the performance area, and just kind of be where we are and be present on it, what we can do is park those things. So if you have athletes that are old enough to drive, they really like being able to think, okay, take your problem, imagine it in your car. Now imagine yourself locking that car and you walking away. The problem will still be there when you get to your car, but it's not in the gym. It's not on the court. It's not on the water. It's not on the ice. It's not with us. And when we get back, you can unlock the car and you can deal with it then, right? Use one of the strategies that we've talked about previously to deal with it or navigate it, but it's not a problem that belongs in our performance or our practice space. So we can leave it in the car. One of the ways, if you have a lot of visual athletes, is I often will bring a box. And what we do is we just have bits of pieces of paper or Post-it notes, and any problems that, again, are on their minds, but that they know don't belong in the performance space, they write it down on a piece of paper, put it in the box, and know that they can go and pick it back up at the end of practice. So it's in the box, I don't need to deal with it. And then if it pops up in their head while they're at practice or while they're doing anything, be like, oh yeah, it's in the box. I'll deal with it later, kind of thing, right? So bringing a physical box is great, or having them leave a note or something in their gym bag or in their equipment bag is also works really, really well, so that they know it's there, they know they'll address it, they don't have to ignore it, but it also doesn't have to interfere or influence their performance while they're at sport, right? So that can be one of the ways that we kind of pause the uncontrollables. We know we'll get back to it, but its time is not right now. For athletes, one of the big things too that we can do is put it in a filing cabinet. So we just kind of we imagine, here's my problem, I'm going to write it down, and then I'm going to put it in an imaginary file cabinet, and I will deal with it when I need to, right? So I will go back to that file cabinet if there comes a time where I need to look at it again. But it's one of the ways that we can kind of sort or process what it is that we're going to by putting it down on a piece of paper or in our phone, things like that, and then being like, I'll get to it when it becomes important again. So that can be one of the examples, or one of the ways and strategies that you use to deal with it. The other way that you can kind of pause things a little bit more is by changing the channel or turning down the volume. So sometimes, again, the problem or the uncontrollable is right in front of us. And so If we don't want to deal with it, or we can't deal with it, or it wouldn't be a great use of our resources to deal with it, what we do is we imagine ourselves changing the channel. Now, when I did this with athletes, I found out that a lot of them don't know what remote controls are anymore. So you might have to think about what's relevant to your athletes. Again, how do they change the channel? Do they actually just tell Siri or Hey Google or any of those things, you know, this is what I need to do, and then we get them to change the channel that way. But what it is whenever there's something that's in front of us, we can change the channel, or whenever something feels like it's really loud in our head, we can just turn down the volume. So we can pretend we take our phone or a music player out and we just turn down the volume on the problem. And then again, we know it's still there. And if we need to get back to the uncontrollable, we can turn the volume up when we have the capacity or the tools or the time to deal with it. Makes sense to everybody so far? Perfect. We will move on to the last thing, which is one of the ways that you can then kind of create your action plan or learn to deal with the uncontrollables in a way that feels better for you. So what we like to do is kind of plan for them by taking all the tools and all the things that we asked and putting them into an actual like table or grid, right? So, okay, what are some of the uncontrollables that I might deal with, or what are some of the uncontrollables that matter to me? And if I were to encounter them, what's something that I can do either before, what's something that I can do while I'm encountering it, or what's something that I've learned from encountering it before that I want to apply in the future. So this, again, can feel really, really overwhelming to athletes. So what I recommend is to just kind of take it one thing at a time. So if the referee, so the uncontrollable here is that the referee is making calls that I don't agree with, you know what? The proactive thing is I'm going to understand the rules a little bit more and make sure that I'm not doing anything that would, you know, make the referees call me out on it, right? So proactively, that's what I'm going to do. In the present, when the referee makes a call that I disagree with, you know what? I'm going to stick to my breathing, or I'm going to stick to my cue words, and that's what I'm going to do to deal with it in the moment. And then in the future, I'm going to talk to my coaches and try to understand what it is that the referees called me out on so that I can do a better job of not doing it again, right? So again, it just becomes this idea of you might have a couple of examples in one category. So maybe you have a lot of things that you can do ahead of time to deal with the uncontrollable. Maybe you don't have anything that you can do in there, but there are things that you can do in the present. So, you know what, the uncontrollable that I want to deal with is the weather. So proactively, I'm going to look at what the weather looks like. I'm going to make sure we have a weather policy in place so that I can communicate to the parents in case things get canceled or changed, or right, proactively, what is it that I want to do to deal with the uncontrollable that matters to me? In the present, if we're experiencing a snowstorm or the power goes out or things like that, what is it? Well, let's make sure that the athletes stay safe. So let me make sure I corral them, or I know where to go, or I know what the emergency action plan is. And if you don't have one of those yet, it's a module that you can do online and you get more PD points for it. So yeah, more two birds with one stone kind of thing, right? So again, we can think about how we want to plan for the uncontrollables. I typically, again, like to start with just one and then like to revisit it after a couple of months or after a significant event, just to kind of see, did the strategies that we wrote down, did they work for you? Did we like them? Do we want to tweak them or adjust them just a little bit? But once you write it down, again, people feel more accountable to actually using the solutions. And they also feel more prepared to use the solutions rather than just having it be something that they know about. It's something that they can actually have in their back pocket. Be like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do when I deal with stress, or when, you know, this really, or when I have a chance to, when I'm experiencing a lot of pressure, things like that. So these things that feel uncontrollable, this is how I want to handle it. Again, you don't have to break it down in the way that I did, but I find it helpful to have multiple strategies or multiple approaches to things, because oftentimes one will work for someone, or one will be enough to kind of get people to feel like they have control over their uncontrollables. But having the options and having the autonomy to make a choice, again, empowers people to actually use the strategies that we talk about. So Manon, I'll get you to go to the last slide. That is everything that I have for you so far. I know it was a lot of me talking, especially in the end, but happy to take any questions. Happy if anybody wants to share examples or wants to discuss anything. Now is your time in French en français ou en anglais or in English, feel free. But thank you all very much for listening and participating and being so engaged. So thank you.
Awesome session, Renee. I took a lot of notes. It will definitely help me in my next training plan moving forward for the next season. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Christine. Thank you.
I agree. Renee, during the whole session, you've had a lot of positive feedback in the comments, especially from informative, some gems. We had a few coaches that unfortunately had to leave early, but they're looking forward to like viewing the recording after. And thank you to all of the coaches that were actually engaged, participated. And I really hope that you were able to take some of these nuggets to add to your coaching toolbox, because unfortunately, as we all know, I feel like we're all living through some uncertainties in one fashion or the other. So very meaningful session. So Renée, thanks so much. It was really appreciated and wonderful. And does anybody else have any questions and other comments that they'd like to share? And luckily for you, we will happily share with you the PowerPoint. So if you're looking at trying to maybe use this as a tool with your athletes or within your leadership team, it's definitely going to be available to you after today. And thank you to Renée for that.
Awesome. Thank you all for spending your Wednesday afternoon or evening with me. Again, time makes no sense. I don't have any control over it. So it is what it is. But thank you all very much. I hope that it was useful for you and that some pieces of information you connected with. If you do have any questions or anything does come up in the future, please feel free to reach out. Happy to talk mental performance at any point in time. But thank you all very much and have a good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Good night.